Before we start this video, I'd like to say thank you to Predator Kai XI6466 who donated £10. Thank you very much. Again, you're a very generous person, and this isn't your first donation, and you're a member, which is amazing. Thanks to this, I'm kind of motivated to make a much longer video than usual, especially based on things that I was already talking about. I will be responding to your comments on video, but I'm still working on those. Thank you. One of the most underestimated things about Africa is its sheer size. Because the continent has people who appear to look the same, people have looked at it as if it's a small region with similar people. But if West Africa was isolated as a region, its size alone could make it a subcontinent or a continent. And the reason for this is because of its distances from one area to another. If we were to apply the mathematics, we will see that this is actually very true for West Africa. And so when we look at West Africa, and I am not including any other part of Africa here in the West, not Congo and not the northern parts, just the regions that we call West Africa, Mauritania, Chad, Nigeria, those regions. If we just compare those regions to other regions in the world, we will see that this small part of Africa is a very large part of a very large continent, which it's hard to analyze on a map. For example, let's take the distance between Senegal and Nigeria, which are pretty much the limits of West Africa. They're not, but they're pretty much the limits of it. This distance, you might think, oh, it's pretty significant. But people don't understand that this is upwards of 2,000 kilometers. Well, what does that mean? Now, when I say 2,000 kilometers, I mean in a straight line shot. So no one is traveling like this between Senegal and Nigeria, but it is true of the distance. So it's best if we quantify it using this map and these numbers, which, there's many ways of doing it, but this is the way that I'm going to do it for this one because I think it's the most accurate that I can get. Traveling with this distance, what we get is 2,589 kilometers or 1,609 miles. Now, some of you might be saying, well, that's kind of fine. That's like almost as far as the distance between California and New York. Well, there is a little bit of a difference. Now, the traveling the same way would be about 3,928 kilometers, which the other one was 2,900, which is 1 kilometer short. But keep in mind, that's West Africa, not the whole continent. West Africa, from one place to another, that is considered the same region. Now, as interesting as it is to compare it to America, I think because America is seen as one united nation, that it could blur our lines. And so it's important to compare it to another continent, especially in the old world. This distance between these two parts, which the reason why I want to do this is because I want to make sure people understand how big the empire of the Mandinka was. So if we look at these two maps, we can see here the distances. So from the United Kingdom, in that specific location of the United Kingdom, all the way to the Ukraine. Think about what I just said. From the United Kingdom all the way to the Ukraine, which is considered a very different part of Europe. We've crossed over so many lands. We've crossed over the Netherlands, France, Germany, and so many other places to land in the Ukraine, that distance is shorter on a curved world, right? A curved earth, than the distance between Nigeria and Senegal. Does this really mean anything to anybody? Well, I want to say again that we're talking about a pretty large area. And so when we see the multiple kingdoms that arise in this area, we should not take them as if they are close neighbors, or we should not take them as if they are one group that cannot be separated into smaller pieces. These people are to be taken as the distance given, that some of them have absolutely nothing to do with each other and they're damn near a continent away from each other. Now, it is impressive that some people were able to conquer this amount of land prior to modern technology and prior to any real outsider influence. So pre-colonial, even though the word colonial is kind of strange in this case because I'm talking about them colonizing their neighbors. Now, of course, I want to highlight that these numbers can be done in very different ways. And if done in different ways, you will get very different measurements. You could add or take away a couple kilometers. But let us do this version because it's the same exact measurement for both sites. So we might be thinking like, oh, Africa is just like this piece of land and you can travel from one place to the other and it's just a distance from each other. So the distance from the United Kingdom all the way to China is roughly 8,000 kilometers. Here it says 7,799 kilometers, which you can see only goes to the middle of China. If you go all the way to the end of China, you get about 8,300 kilometers. And here you have the distance between Senegal and Mozambique, which is in the Swahili coast, a world away, which is 6,595 kilometers. But if you travel in this curved way, the same way that you are doing in China, you will get about 7,900 kilometers. So if you do it using the same methods in each one, you get about a distance of 1,000 kilometers. The distance between China and the United Kingdom is 1,000 kilometers longer than the distance between Mozambique and Senegal, no matter how you measure it. Now, here's the thing about that. To most people, you cannot call people from the UK the same as people from China in any way, shape, or form. In fact, the people in the Middle East and the people in the Turkish regions would be considered a whole thing completely on their own as human beings. If you look at Senegal and Mozambique, they are considered West African born type human beings. The other people living there, the Khoisan, the Twa, again, would be considered part of the African people. Now, what we must remember is that these people themselves would not consider themselves exactly the same in a time before colonization. They would consider themselves very distant tribes. And in fact, most of them had no contact with each other. And when they did have contact, it could be war, it could be peace, and it could be war. Now, understand the length of this means that Africa in itself was a world. And so when we talk about the Mali Empire that stretches from the western parts of Chad all the way to the limits the islands of Senegal. We are not talking about the Mali Empire, the mini empire that existed in Africa. We are talking about a land greater than the Zulu nation in size, greater than a lot of the area of empires that existed in Europe, in China, or just about anywhere. We're talking about a giant stretched land, and controlling these type of lands is almost impossible without the division of chieftainships. Without the division of chieftainships, what you get is very small allegiances to a king that you might have never even seen before, which is why the Mali Empire was divided. And we even know that little places within the Mali Empire, which is why the Mandinka people from the entire continent, some of them probably adopting the term Mandinka, that why the people of the Mandinka who take up this entire West African continent, in quotation marks, why they have specific names of a Mandinka king that is regional to their areas. Now, we must remember that this empire existed at a specific time, and it was not always the empire that existed. Of course, there was the empire of Ghana that was before it, but then these places used to be completely separate areas. Now, of course, if we look at the distance between Senegal and Niger, two places that would be part of the Mali Empire, what we see is 2,400 kilometers. Again, we are talking about very strong distances, and how we calculate it is important as well. We're talking about two people who would probably never see each other in their entire lifetime, even though they quote unquote belong to the same empire. And I'm not talking about the general person inside the kingdom. I'm talking about well learned scholars who travel throughout their country. Some of them would have never made it to Senegal at all. With this in mind, if we go back into Africa, especially Senegal, which is the one we're going to focus on, what we see is the tumuli that we see in just about every part of West Africa and North Africa, but we're ignoring the rest of the countries and focusing specifically on Senegal. There are a unique pattern in Senegal of stone circles that are first seen around the 3rd century BC and were continued up until 1100 AD. Why did these people create these circles? Now, obviously, they had to do with burials, but spirituality is there, geometric patterns are there, and so many other things that we probably are not aware of are utilized within these stone circles. These stone circles, which are displayed in very intentionally pathwayed areas, show that this was not an area to be discarded. And it's located, most of them, in the Nyani regions of Senegal. And these Nyani people are one of the 8 kingdoms that I mentioned. Actually, the biggest one, the Nyani kingdom, which broke apart and became smaller kingdoms which operated together and could be considered a republic or a democracy, meaning that there might have been internal votes within the smaller chieftainship, and then that those chiefs went and represented the people in a bigger way with the kings, and then those kings with the emperor. To remind ourselves of these 8 kingdoms, because it is going to be very important in the future, the 8 kingdoms are that of Bara, the second being Wakanda, The third being the Bada, or the Badison as they're called them, Saloum, which surrounds the first three mentioned areas, a smaller provincial region called Nyani, which is only mainly coastal. Kohan, number seven, is Nyani again, but this one is different than the previous one. And then there is Wuli. While those people were populated by very similar people, they could not all be necessarily considered under the Nyani completely. The one area that we know for a fact was under the Nyani at the time is the area of Wuli. Now, there are some others there were as well. And then in later times, some pieces would fall to people like the Jollof and so many others, including, of course, in the final years, the Europeans. Although there are these stone circles located in the Senegambia regions, it's not the most interesting thing about that area. The interesting thing is the use of massive rocks, which were thought to not be used by Africans to build anything, but the use of massive rocks to build tumuli. Some of these tumuli have been flattened out, but still there was an understanding of how to construct buildings. In fact, there are foundations that have been left over from previous kingdoms that go before the Mali Empire, which show circular structures of houses that we have no idea who built it because of how far away it is in history. Some of these things that we might call a unified culture might be several cultures that had several similarities but were not unified. So, in the same way that if you go to South Africa today, you will find stone circle buildings which belong to a people who are close to the Zulus but are not the Zulus and were eventually captured by the Zulus. These stone buildings, which some Africans, some Zulus, some Xhosas, some other people in South Africa would have tumuli like burials, but that doesn't mean they're the same as the people who built the stone circles. So it's not obvious that the same people who built the foundations are the same as the people who built these pillared circles, which represent burials. Metals are not found here as early as they are in places like Nigeria. And so we should keep that in mind, that even things like metals took time to arrive in these kingdoms. And so the question is, if we look at the Mali kingdom, what exactly did these people have that would make the people of Mali even care to conquer their kingdoms? What is it about their lands that is special and different? Gold, we got that all over the Mali kingdom. Palm oil, all over the Mali kingdom. In fact, it seems like a giant waste of time to go into these areas. Until, of course, you look at the map and you analyze the fact that almost the entire empire of Mali is inland. The areas that they wanted to conquer in the coastal regions brought to them the magic of coastal enterprise. This includes shellfish, which became a very important source of food inside of the Mali kingdom, traded throughout the entire Mali kingdom and also inside places like Chad, which also happened to be inland. And so there was a lot of netting and grabbing a lot of fish of this type inside of that area. But another thing that was done was whaling, which I've described was a very lucrative way of making money in these West African kingdoms a long time ago. Because, of course, you would get ambergris. Ambergris becomes a fragrance. This fragrance is used all over the continent, and the places that did this, and we know they must have had a deep history of it in West Africa, are the Swahili coast, the people who are Bantu from the Swahili coast, and the Bantus who are in the south of West Africa. And so we know that this history must have started somewhere in West Africa because they carried on this tradition. But it's not only that. Remember, to the west of West Africa, one thing that we hear about from Ibn Battuta is the collection of salt. The collection of salt happened to be done in regions very close to these. Now, Senegambia had its own salt collection that was internal, but it was nothing compared to the size of the salt collection that was done in places like Walata. In order to understand this importance, first notice where Senegal is right next to Mauritania on this map. This is important because when I flip to the map that's going to show the historical regions of Africa, we will see that these regions were very close to Senegal and they had real benefit for Senegal as a trade partner. As you can see, some of the closest places are Audagust, Kumbisala, Ijil, Wadon, Walata, Tagaza, which was a very important trade region for Senegal, and a very important trade region for Morocco and the rest of the Mali Kingdom. So, why are these places important, including Janneh, by the way? Why are these places important? Well, it's because these regions are mentioned by Ibn Battuta, and Ibn Battuta mentions a faraway area, Senegal, which also benefited greatly from the trade of these people. A debate that is still going on among scholars is what exactly did this do to the population and the region in the area? If we look at the unique styles that were occupied or used by Africans, especially in places like Senegal, we see these. Now, they might not seem that distant from any other place in Africa, but they are. And they also show, which is one of the things that one of the early French people who came there noticed, they noticed that there is a type of fashion or a type of fashion event that happens all the time inside of Senegal, highlighted by femininity and their beauty. Now, these events still happen. You've seen even Zulu people doing this. They do it in front of, they used to do it in front of Europeans, staging these large things where women walk around in circular patterns, and then the chief chooses the most beautiful amongst them and marries them. This is something that actually happened. And it's not just a physical beauty thing. People would take their time to do this in order to be selected, which highlights, by the way, the cotton which was being used, silk introduced by other Western like people, West African like people to this region. And of course, by this time, iron is being utilized. You've got belts, you've got all kinds of things that are in place, copper as well. So I think it's important for us to understand that there were also factories located in Senegal. These factories were so sophisticated that some of the Europeans just assumed that they were European factories. This is a very important point, and you will see that the myth withstood a long time that Europeans built factories as early here as the 1400s. But we know that people like Ibn Battuta, who crossed places like Senegal, never mentioned one European being located in these areas. And so in the 1400s, it's damn near impossible for these lands to have had Europeans. These myths give us something very, very interesting. But what is that? Well, they tell us of great factories that built things in the area, and they point to these factories. But instead of giving credit to the Africans, they say that they were built by the Normans or early French workers, as I will read. Now, this has been dismissed, and I'll read from Wikipedia because the other version is longer and I want to save it for a different video. But we'll read from Wikipedia the dismissal of this by modern scholars. And then I will read you an example of one of these people who actually believe this. According to several ancient sources, including occasions by the Directionnaire de Pédagogie et d'Instruction Première by Ferdinand Busson in 1887, the first French settlement in Senegal dates back to Diape mariners in the 14th century, flattering for Norman sailors. This argument gives credence also to the idea of precedence of the French presence in the region, but it is not confirmed by subsequent work. Now, the next part is the true history of Europeans traveling into West Africa, and you will see that this work of traveling to West Africa by this time is not consistent with what these guys are saying. Most of it was just landing in these areas, in the coastal areas, most of which are islands. So, as we read, in the mid 15th century, the 1400s, several European nations reached the coast of West Africa, vested successfully or simultaneously by the Portuguese. French and Normans are not the people who we should be worried about. It was the Portuguese under people like Enrique the Navigator, whose people talk of people from places close to Senegal, but nowhere near, having being helped by these people. So as we continue to read, successfully or simultaneously by the Portuguese, the Dutch, the English, and French, Europeans first settled along the coast on the island in the mouths of the river, and then a little further upstream, they opened trading posts and engaged in the trade, a term which under the ancient regime means type of trade, wheat, pepper, ivory, and not necessarily or only the slave trade. To be honest, by this time, it was not the slave trade for the most part, and even the amount of slaves that they would have gathered was not nearly close to what would happen in later centuries. Although this infamous traffic, as it is called, at the end of the 18th century was indeed at the heart of the new economic order controlled by the powerful companies and privilege. Now, here's the thing about reading books in historical times: you must have discernment, you must be vigilant. You cannot just take all the information that you get and treat it as if it is true facts. And I will show you the difference between a good writer in the past and a bad writer. And a lot of these bad writers just copied information that they had heard from other people. Others copied as well, but confirmed it too. This writing is from J.B. Leonard Durand, or Jean Leonard Durand, the one that I was reading from earlier. Now, he had real understanding of what was currently happening, but then his speculations of the past show his ignorance of these areas. As we read, the part of the coast near this river was like all the rest, discovered by the Normans, who probably, keyword right there, probably, tells you that he's already speculating, formed establishments along it, which they abandoned for the more rich and permanent situations of the Senegal and the Gold Coast. All of this is speculation based on nothing and has been dismissed. The Portuguese then occupied these spots which the Normans had left, and it may be seen by the ruins of their factories and the forts which they erected that they had penetrated very far into the interior. The wars in which they were involved with the other nations of Europe at length rendered them incapable of supporting their power in that part of the world. Yet the Portuguese families remained there, were naturalized amongst the inhabitants, while their descendants gradually became Africans, have spread into the interior, and live on good terms with the natives. The latter are the subject of a multitude of petty princes who all take the title of king, though the territories of many of them are very small. There are no less than 8 of these kingdoms on each bank of the Gambia in a space of about 250 leagues from its mouth. So let us pick apart that whole entire area of talk. So when he talks about the Normans and the French and all of that, that did not happen. That part is not real. What is true is that there are small amounts of people who worked with the people who came with Henry the Navigator and landed in the coasts of what you would call Gambia. And of course, like I said, Henry the Navigator wanted to find out how big Africa was. And so these people used natives to try and figure this out. And the success of it is something that needs to be talked about in a different video. But what's more important is a very small number of people, and this happens everywhere, abandoned going back to their native land. And they were like, what the hell? I can just live in this specific region, continue to be Christian, and be richer than I would ever be in my native land. And so a lot of citizens, well, a small amount of citizens from Portugal who came as explorers married the locals and stayed. It's an insignificant number, but we know that it's more than zero. The word Senegal is a pretty weird word, don't you think? And we do understand that most words in the history of Africa either come from outside or inside. This word Senegal is not known exactly where it comes from, but the closest word relating to Senegal is Zenaga. The Zenaga are a type of Berber that can be found in Senegal and Mauritania. These Zenaga Berbers are seen constantly trading with the Jollof. Well, who are these Zenaga Berbers? These Zenaga are described as living in the Negrolands and are a Negro race of people, but have obvious connections traditionally with other Berbers located everywhere in the world, wherever you want to pick at it. These Zenaga, who lived in a completely separate way, documented by several historians, including Ibn Battuta and European author Draper, these people who lived in their own way compared to some of the other Africans and speak a Berber language are tied to Mauritania, and they are mostly to be found in the north of Senegal, or Senegal, if you would like. It is not hard to trace where this word comes from if you look at the ancient sources, because they mention the Zanaga River. The Zanaga River, also known as the Senegal River, runs through many countries, but of course, it runs through Senegal. Writers like Offer Drappert and others write that this region was called the Kingdom of Zenega, or the country of Jolloфs. So the country itself is the country of the Jollof people, while there is a kingdom of Zenega. Now you must be very careful, because this might make it seem like they were most impressed by the Zenega people, but this is the furthest from the truth. In fact, they say, at least Alfred Draper says, that the Zenega had no real concept of architecture. Even their king's buildings were mean at best. In other words, at best, they were made of piled up mud or sticks. Now, we know that this is not necessarily true, but that would be the majority of houses, since the Zenega, like most Berbers, had a nomadic streak. The Zenega, emulating or being the same as the other Berbers, are semi nomadic. This is one of the reasons why they don't have the type of technology that you will see further south in Senegal, or even further east of West Africa, for the Jolloфs, for example, and other peoples of these regions. Now, the obvious interesting thing about that is that there's a lot of assumptions that a lot of technologies that come down to West Africa came via Berbers, and that things like cotton, things like houses and stuff like that came via Berbers. But as you can see, people who are related to Berbers in Morocco and places like that, they themselves live a lifestyle that would not necessarily give us an indication that they would be more sophisticated in culture, whatever that means, compared to the other people who represent a more Niger style life, or a more West African typical lifestyle. While the Europeans were not that impressed by the Zenega people and what they had to offer, what they were impressed by was the kingdom of Gago, or the kingdom of Gaja, of the Gajaga people. These people created a metropolis, and we shall see what they have to say about it. The kingdom of Gago, thus called from its metropolitan Gago, hath in the east the kingdom of Guber, but is divided by a desert, the chief city Gago standing by the river Zenaga, about 100 miles from Tambut southeast in 35 longitude and 8.5 latitude, hath for the most part mean and ordinary houses, yet some of them shew well, as among others the king's palace and seraglio. The rest of the inhabited places consist in villages and hamlets, in which the countrymen and people of meaner state have their abode. The country abounds in corn, rice, and cattle, but they have no grapes, nor other fruits except melons, cucumbers, and curtains, which are much used, having more than an ordinary relish. This city, like others, is not without any inconveniences, being destitute of fresh water, which they are forced to fetch out of the pits 40 or 50 miles from the town. Yet this want is plentifully supplied by the abundance of gold that is in this kingdom, which, according to Megao is fetched from thence by the Moroccans. The country people are not bookish, taking no delight in literature, for not one in 3 days' journey is to be found that scarce knows one letter of the book, yet the citizens are much civiler and better taught than these rustics. Now you're probably thinking, why exactly is Senegal connected to Morocco in any kind of way, or Marrakesh in any type of way when it comes to trade? Well, Senegal has something that is very interesting, and it's past, of course. Now, remember the Zanaga that I mentioned, which are part of the Senegal kingdom. The Zanaga people acted as one of the great facilitators for one of the greatest dynasties that ever occurred in history, which is that of the Almoravid. Now, the Almoravid dynasty was felt as far up as Europe and as far south as Senegal. And this Almoravid dynasty led to a continuous trade between Senegal and Marrakesh in ways that are more unique than ever. These trade routes, first of all, included basic travel, so traveling through land, through Mauritania, all the way down to Senegal. But the second one involved using the ocean, so traveling by boats from Senegal to Morocco. This gave rise to a type of fishing industry and trade industry that would grow significantly during the time of the Almoravid. This fishing and trading industry that uses boats was called the Imragen. The maritime history of this area is very well calculated, and several historians give accounts of why these shores were mainly traversed by black Africans. Even people like Moroccans did not dare to come on the shore. For there are two things that happened. One being the fact that the Berbers knew about the hostilities against the Europeans in places as far as Morocco. So boats and buildings. Now remember, a lot of the boats that Europeans were building at this time were inspired by African boats, so North African boats, and also some of the Mauritanian boats. Those, for example, were one of those that inspired their sails, and they changed the shape of their sails because of the North Africans slash West Africans. One writer even writing, stretching from west north, west to east, southeast, of all which coasts I will give the best account I am able, the natives being so rude that few Europeans dare go ashore. Before I read this part, I want to make sure I make you understand that this is due to their connection with other Berbers, including those in Morocco. The fact that the Zanaga did this, and this is one of the things they did to the Portuguese. It had nothing to do with the other versions of the quote unquote Negroes who lived a completely different lifestyle and were described much different in their behavior. The king of the Zanaga hath no certain custom or revenues, but his chief riches consists in presents sent to him by other princes to purchase his friendship, and those are principally horses, a creature of high price and estimation here. Cows, goats, shell, fruit, mill, and such like. But his greatest and most peculiar advantage riseth from the sale of slaves. The king of these places have a custom to seize the goods of the Portugals and other people after their death, to the great enrichment of themselves. and when they perceive any to have gathered a considerable estate, and that there is no apparent probability of their dying, out of their covetous desire of possessing their goods, they poison them, and that this is no fiction. Experience hath manifested by the immediate seizure of some yet languishing, whose distemper these wretches, knowing and thereby ascertained of ensuing death, become confident by their own villainy, wherefore it is good for such as trade there neither to purchase land or build houses, but to keep only board their ships and boats. So, as you can see here, an exact description, a very true understanding of the Zenega as a ship riding, boat carrying people who operate with the Moroccans and also carry out the same level of, I guess, villainy that the Portuguese and the French had already described inside of Morocco, where the people inside of Morocco, the Europeans, when they arrived in Morocco, would be, first of all, their boats would be taken from them by the pirates, and then secondly, the inhabitants of the land would strip them of their clothing, and they would continue to take their naked bodies and make them into slaves. This is a much wider tradition that happened, and you can see here that the Zenega are no exception. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that there were more ships than there were canoes. There were definitely more canoes that operated, but most of these canoes were built for rivers rather than the ocean. In the ocean, they tended to use ships, large and small, because, of course, in an ocean, you need to be moved in a more directional way, meaning you have to use sails. If you're going to paddle, you're going to need to paddle a lot, and you're going to need to use other navigational inventions, especially if you're traveling very long distances. Now, Africans tended for a long time to use small boats around this Atlantic region because, of course, they had no intention of traveling too far away from the area. And in fact, they were aware of being swept away on large boats from an island, which I won't mention now, it doesn't matter. It's an island which the French decided to stay on so that they can continue to trade with the Africans without being on the shore of Africa proper. Due to winds, the opportune moments to come due to winds and other environmental factors was a specific time between October in this part of the world. And what they did was they did carry out this time. Now, remember, though, there was a lot of meeting people halfway because the Europeans were afraid of these people, but they did trade with them. Now, the trade over the oceans between the Europeans and the Africans of the Zenega are very different than what the Jolofs would trade with the Europeans. These are the tools of the Zenega. I'm not going to read all of them. I'm going to read the top paragraph only. The trade driven by the merchants of Europe in these kingdoms is transacted most between the beginning of October and the last of May. In the rest of the month, the blacks are busy in tilling of their grounds. The wares desired by the blacks and carried over thither out of Europe are these following, of which brandy and iron are the chief, for they use great quantities of iron to make bows and arrows, harping irons, assegais, javelins, and other utensils for their fishing trade, tillage, and husbandry. Now, of course, if you compare this to one of those kingdoms that I showed you that had such an onerous payment on the side of the Europeans that Europeans themselves started banning the trade from that particular kingdom, you can see that these guys are less strict about what they want to trade. And this is why they went this far. Now, remember that these guys are not losing in terms of trade in their own kingdom because, of course, iron is a very, very wanted item in this region, even though they could make their own. Lastly, let us look at these types of buildings. What is this? What are we looking at right now? Well, these are traditionally made storehouses and they are put on top of rocks for a reason. The reason is because these are storehouses for grain. This is why they could wait a pretty long time to make sure that they can continue their tilling, continue their personal labor within their own kingdom without real trade from Europeans or anybody else outside of their kingdoms. These types of structures firstly show us that the Zanaga had a continuous history with the people who are Jollof, so they have some similarities in their history because the Zanaga have their own version, though these are still Senegal like more like the native Senegal people who are not Zanaga. The ones made by the Zanaga tend to be made of wood or straw, still propped up, because of course, why wouldn't you prop it up? If you don't prop it up like this, animals will get to it and stuff like that. I throw them in because I think it's very interesting that we know nothing about how Africans maintained their food. Now, before I start reading, I have to make sure to let you understand that the Zanaga that is being talked about are those close to Senegal. And yes, they did have a sophisticated history continuing. But of course, this is from the experience of one person. So let's read. Neither the king of Zanaga nor any other have any walled cities, fortifications, or palaces, the best habitations being only round structures made of sticks, fetched out of the woods, about 3 fathom above the ground, encompassed with a fence of reeds, and covered with straw, having a low door, so that without stooping none can go in or out. Their household stuff is only arms, axes to cut wood, an iron spade to throw up the earth, with all instead of plows, and some earthen pots to which the sea coasters add nets and other necessary belonging for fishing. The greatest employment as to matter of getting a livelihood is digging, keeping of cattle, and fishing. Some few follow merchandising, while others busy themselves either at the forge making horseshoes and arms of war, or in weaving, in both which, though their masterpieces, yet are they but mean workmen. In the village Kandina, and this is a very special village, it's not the entire kingdom. In the village Kandina, all the men are fishers, and all the women merchants. This might arc back, of course, to a previous time in history where this is how they kind of lived. They live quiet but poorly, and trouble themselves neither with pride nor overwork themselves. Only in seed time they go diligently to order the ground, and sow milly, whereof in the 3 months' time they receive the crop. And if they prove negligent in that, it turns to their great shame and disgrace. for the greatest men in this country accompany their laborers in the field. After the meal is cut up and brought into the barn, the woman, by stamping it in the wooden mortar, separate it from the chaff, then cleaning it in the wind. They put it in straw baskets of about 3 fathoms wide and 7 or 8 hands in height, wherein they lay up so much as they suppose, according to their account, they can live upon a whole year. The baskets thus filled, they leave covered with green leaves and stones laid on the top in the fields, their common storehouse. Now, we still have to talk about the Kingdom of Caire and so many other kingdoms located close to Senegal, but I have to say this. I hope you understand my point about the size of Senegal and the size of West Africa in general, and why I made this point in the beginning. Because, of course, we're looking at tens of kingdoms packed in a very small location, speaking multiple languages and having a very diverse history, and some exclusively working amongst ships and others working exclusively amongst land, having completely different relationships with Europeans and Moroccans, others being taken as slaves to be sold to the Moroccans, and others being one of the same as the Moroccans. Thank you very much. Like, share, subscribe. There's definitely going to be a part two because I haven't even started scratching the surface of this region of West Africa. I did skim past the other parts of West Africa, to be honest, but that is to be expected when you're looking at the entirety of West Africa.